Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I will try to keep my introductions as short as possible so that we have as much time for the presenters. We have 4 exceptional papers and presenters with us today. And this is the session on trauma, justice, and the margins of faith. And I will introduce them just before they speak rather than introduce them all 4 at once. So the first speaker is a good friend of mine for a number of years, all the way back from England, Burton from Adventist Health University, and he will present a paper, Living While Black, Toxic Triggers and Adventist Trauma. Thank you.
Thank you, Zach. Starting with Du Bois. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, 2 souls, 2 thoughts, 2 unreconciled strivings, 2 warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. When I started developing my thoughts, I was tempted to modify Du Bois's prescient insight. Overthinking the issue, I intended to make a case for a triple consciousness, informed by national identity, ethnic reality, and denominational affiliation. It soon became clear that even in the denominational realm, the issue is still one of double consciousness. As in my life and ministry, I am continually aware that I am often looking at myself through the eyes of others. Too often, I feel as if I belong to an institution that only acknowledges my presence because my black body provides a statistical digit for false advertising about a multicultural remnant. The proof of concept for this marketing strategy is evident in the fact that even with my heightened awareness of the farcical claim of inclusion, I am still here. Like my forebears living under American, Caribbean, and African emanations of Jim Crow apartheid, I have been forced to develop creative coping methods to live with the terrorizing trauma that permeates every global institution, including the Seventh-day Adventist Church. I'm going to jump over the next section where I define trauma, showing how it changed from being a term describing a physical wound to a psychological wound in the 19th century. And move into the section, if you're following, continuous traumatic stress. Du Bois's observation of double consciousness explains the major catalyst for the psychological condition that anti-apartheid mental health activists in the 1980s labeled continuous traumatic stress. Unlike post-traumatic stress, the trauma is not confined to a physical or psychological event in the past, but is ongoing. CTS explains the experience of those subjected to cruel forms of torture and is a more accurate description for the collective pain of African Americans. I can understand why some would identify slavery as the traumatic trigger for the Black experience and analyze current social issues through a PTS lens. However, as Harvard epidemiologist David Williams and others have so brilliantly quantified with their everyday discrimination scale, the trauma experienced by Black folk in America is not inflicted by isolated stimuli, but is a persistent systemic reality. To be Black in this society is to live in a constant state of trauma. The modern architects of the complex mechanisms used to inflict various degrees of tortures on Black folk in society have adapted the strategy of the 4th century Roman Empire, which usurped the Christian church to advance its imperialist agenda. Therefore, it is no surprise that the Seventh-day Adventist Church is actively complicit in the cruel and continuous assault against continental and dispersed Africans. Undoubtedly, many will dismiss my observation as they point to the global nature of our denomination in which white people are increasingly becoming a minority. Some may even point to the brilliant work of Kevin Burton and Benjamin Baker, which reveals a time when our denominational forebears had more in common with the abolitionist Quakers than the segregationist Southern Baptist. I will address the second observation first, roots of traumatic triggers in Adventism. We do celebrate the abolitionist roots of some in the middle right movement and their theological heirs, but failed to see that even the sincerest among them may have embodied an embedded prejudice that would have been difficult for them to recognize. For instance, when seeking a modern parallel for the second beast of Revelation 13, some of our pioneers courageously pointed to America as a natural fit to the lamb-like beast, and even heralded slavery as an indisputable indicator. In his Key to the Prophetic Chart, published a year after Lincoln's executive order promising emancipation only to enslaved Africans in states that were not even under his jurisdiction, Uriah Smith would write, "The lamb feature is a fit emblem of the profession and the early acts of this government, but it speaks like a dragon, a fit emblem of the practice of this hypocritical nation. Look at the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and then look at slavery." Uriah Smith. However, when he published his comprehensive commentary some 3 decades later, there was not even the slightest allusion to slavery, and absolutely no mention of the landmark Plessy versus Ferguson decision issued the previous year. The language of a hypocritical nation is gone, and America's dragon-like behavior is projected to the future when the government will enact unjust and oppressive laws against the religious profession and practice of some of its subjects in the future. Almost as if possessed by another consciousness, Smith is now the evangelical patriot who writes, "We must remember that in the last days, the vast majority of the people of the most favored lands are to relapse into the low moral condition described in scriptures." With Smith's backpedaling, it is no wonder that the Southern Publishing Association would have no problem in their 1944 deceptive posthumous editing of Daniel and the Revelation, when they're portraying America is not as a government full of religious intolerance, corruption, and oppression as Smith described in 1864, but now is a nation rising so peaceably and devoted to such noble principles of government. The distancing from justice and general human rights is blatantly evident in the Seventh-day Adventist identification of the mark of the beast. For the Europeans who shaped the church doctrine, there was no repulsion over the blatant display of beastly behavior and the usurpation of native lands. Additionally, their haplotypic affinity with the oppressor allowed them to quickly forget the dragon's tenacious torture of the children of Africa through slavery and its revised emanation after the compromise of 1877. Forget the millions of people suffering under the cruelty of colonial rule. They were still imbued by the little flock mentality. As far as they were concerned, the only possible application for the mark of the beast was a future Sabbath Sunday showdown. In their legalistic minds, God loved the Sabbath more than people. African Americans embracing Adventism were so shaped by this legalistic misapplication of the gospel that they were subtly forced to ignore the reality that the mark of Revelation's beast has been so deeply embedded in the very fabric of the United States. To embrace the Seventh-day Adventist interpretation of apocalyptic prophecy required a negotiated double consciousness that mandated a denial of our lived experience. From the very inception, Black Seventh-day Adventists have been programmed to ignore the legacy of slavery and imperialism in society and church, as they join their European counterparts in lambasting the evils of Catholicism while heralding Protestantism as a bastion for truth. We are invited to participate in collective amnesia by ignoring that the churches represented by Martin Luther, King James VI, Aldrich Zwingli, John Knox, John Calvin, and John Wesley following the schism of 1844 to 1845 were at the forefront of the slave trade. They were taught to embrace the lie of a pure Protestantism that in reality had been apostate from its founding. While I do not believe she meant deliberate harm, some of Ellen White's statements have contributed to the church's dismissive attitude towards the Black experience. She must definitely be celebrated for her courage in confronting the system of slavery, advocating civil disobedience, and encouraging believers to disobey the Fugitive Slave Act. At the same time, she must be held accountable for the cultural arrogance evident in her acquiescence to eugenicist ideology. Although couched in the language of grace, why would she assume that enslaved people had endured living hell at the hands of the dragon's servants would be denied a place in eternity because in their ignorance and degradation, in her term, they were lower than the enslavers, brute beasts, Ellen White's terms. Further, even in the much celebrated Southern work, she would lament, among most of the colored people, we find unseemly practices in their worship. She appears appalled when they become much excited and put forth physical exertions, like Pedrito made it read, that are uncalled for in the solemn worship of God. The remedy of the perceived problem betrays the deep embeddedness of the seemingly unconscious notion of European cultural supremacy. She says, let not the colored people be excluded from the religious assemblies of the white people. They have no chance to exchange their superstitious exercises for a worship that is more sacred and elevated. I'm sure that apologists who come across this counsel attempt to vindicate her by pointing to the sentence, let not the colored people be excluded from the religious assemblies of the white people, which appears to be a call to unity. But those who are tempted to do this are totally ignoring the rationale for such counsel. In fact, it gets worse from there. She contrasts the intelligent white people to the ignorant workers who need instruction and guidance. In no uncertain terms, she was convinced that God favored European culture, and to gain divine approval, blacks had to suppress their very identity, at least until the resurrection. For in heaven, there would be no color line, for all would be as white as Christ himself. Again, in Ellen White's language. Normalization of triggers in Adventism. Undoubtedly, emboldened by Ellen G. White's problematic statements, successive generations of Adventist leaders in the SDA Church have continued to inflict psychological trauma on its non-European constituents through its imposition of Eurocentric norms. The recalcitrant and continuous assault is so ubiquitous that the victims have numbed themselves to the pain. Few take shock at the contemptuous bigotry in the Seventh-day Adventist Church manual, in which we are warned we should exercise great care in the choice of music in our homes, social gatherings, schools, and churches. Any melody partaken of the nature of jazz, rock, or related hybrid forms, or any language expressing foolish or trivial sentiments will be shunned. Now, while music influenced by African cultures is denounced, the Seventh-day Adventist hymnal is unapologetic in its use of scores from Bach, Beethoven, Mozart, Welsh melodies, Finnish folk tunes, Gaelic melodies, Russian airs, English melodies, Netherlands folk songs, and the list goes on at general conference sessions and beyond. If I talk about waltzing in church, redeemed that by anyway. I don't have much time, so how am I going to end this? Okay, double consciousness, need this double consciousness. Let me jump to this. Most recently, the assassination of Christian nationalist Charlie Kirk elevated the indifference towards black sensibilities in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Kirk was a young conservative who devoted his life to propagate the Christian nationalism that yearned for an American era where the dominant place of the colonist descendants was unquestioned. Reading from the dog whistle playbook of the architects of the Southern strategy, he would refer to affirmative action in black campus clubs as inherently racist and dismiss the well-established reality of white privilege as a myth. He also fed raw meat to his base of statements like happening all the time in urban America. Prowling blacks going round for fun to go target white people. That's a fact, he says. His general disdain towards African Americans is evident in such statements as if I see a black pilot, I'm going to be like, boy, I hope he's qualified. But shortly before his death, he would lament, America was at its peak when we halted immigration for 40 years, and we dropped our foreign-born percentage to its lowest level ever. We should be unafraid to do that. Following his untimely death, we heard the eulogies by Batchelor and Finley, Batchelor, how the mighty have fallen. Finley, why did God let Charlie Kirk die, as he places him among the 144,000? And perhaps the boldest evidence came from the Northern New England Conference, when on September 10, 2025, they write, we affirm Charlie's courage and commitment to the Christian faith, biblical marriage, strong family values, and the seventh-day Sabbath. Deluded by a pharisaical presumption of doctrinal correctness, those who penned this statement demonstrate deference to sepulchred religion that neglects the weightier matters of the law, justice, and mercy, and faith. In conclusion, I can hear someone asking, If racism has entrenched itself so deeply in the church, why are you still a member? This is a justifiable question. Why would a person stay in a system that continues to assault and insult many of its members? I have thought about it repeatedly, even as I developed the conclusion to this paper. Why am I still here? I find myself wondering if I have rejected Kunta Kinte in favor of Toby. As I ponder, I am aware of that still small voice reminding me why I abandoned my decision to modify Du Bois's double consciousness. The trauma that comes from living while Black cannot be escaped in this world. It is inherent in all systems. Rather than surrendering to the bullying beast, my decision to stay is driven by a desire to side with the protagonists in the cosmic conflict. If there is any chance of healing the systemic trauma in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, we can no longer continue with business as normal. Silence, denial, and token appeasements are not the answer. Restoration can only come when church leaders and members recognize the depths to which the embedded toxic triggers have negatively impacted both the victim and the perpetrator, while often unaware of the degree of their suffering or complicity. The church must be willing to repent for straying from the gospel's invitation to an intentional society that is diverse, equitable, and inclusive, replacing it with a European distortion based on cultural homogeneity, partiality, and exclusion. I am committed to doing my part. Ultimately, living while Black does not necessitate my acquiescence to victimhood, but challenges me to become an agent of healing for both the traumatized and those whose actions trigger trauma. Maranatha.